from George Ivanovich Gurdjieff's All and Everything. Chapter 30. Art. Reading 2. On Saturdays, the day of mysteries, or the day of the theater, the demonstrations produced by learned members of this group were the most interesting and, as it is said, the most popular. I personally preferred these Saturdays to all the other days of the week and tried not to miss one of them. And I preferred them because the demonstrations arranged on those days by the learned beings of that group frequently provoked such spontaneous and sincere laughter among all the other terrestrial three-centered beings who were in the given section of the club that I sometimes forgot among which three-centered beings I was, and that being impulse manifested itself in me, which is proper to arise only in one-natured beings like myself. At the outset, the learned beings of that group demonstrated before the other members of the club various forms of being experiencings and being manifestations. Then, later, they collectively selected from all that was demonstrated what corresponded to the various details of one or another already existing mystery, or of one newly created by themselves. And only after all this did they indicate in those being experiencings and manifestations, reproduced by them what they wished, by means of intentionally allowed deviations from the principles of the law of sevenfoldness. Here it is necessary to notice that although in former epochs mysteries occasionally containing many instructive notions chanced to reach some of their generations mechanically, and sometimes passed from generation to generation to beings of very remote generations, yet those mysteries in the contents of which the learned members of the Club of the Adherents of Legal Monism then intentionally placed varied knowledge, calculating that it would reach beings of very remote generations, have during recent times almost totally ceased to exist. These mysteries there, incorporated in the process of their ordinary existence centuries earlier, already began gradually to disappear soon after the Babylonian period. At first, their place was taken by what are called their kizbaji, or, as they are now called there on the continent Europe, puppet shows, petrushka. But afterwards they were finally ousted by their still existing theatrical shows or spectacles, which are there now, one of the forms of that said contemporary art of theirs which acts particularly perniciously in the process of the progressive shrinking of their psyche. These theatrical spectacles replaced the mysteries after the beings at the beginning of the contemporary civilization, to whom only a fifth to a tenth was passed down of the information about how and what these said Babylonian learned mystics had done, began to think of imitating them in this also, and set about doing, as it were, the same. From that time on, the other beings there called these imitators of the mystics players, comedians, actors, and at the present time they already call them artists, of whom I may say very many have sprung up during recent times. And these learned beings of that time belonging to the group of the mystics indicated various useful information, and the knowledge already attained by them, by means of what are called currents of associative movements, of the participants in these mysteries. Although the three-brained beings of your planet then already well knew about the laws of the currents of associative movements, yet absolutely no information whatsoever concerning these laws has passed to the contemporary three-brained beings. As this said currents of associative movements does not proceed in the presences of the three-brained beings who have taken your fancy, as it generally proceeds in the presences of other three-brained beings, and as there were quite special reasons there for this, proper to them alone, I must therefore first of all explain it to you in rather more detail. The process is the same as that which also proceeds in us, but it proceeds in us when we are intentionally resting to allow the whole functioning of our common presence freely to transform, without hindrance by our will, all the varieties of being energy required for our all-round active existence, whereas in them, these said various being energies can now arise only during their total inactivity, that is, during what they call their sleep, and then, of course, only after a fashion. Owing to the fact that they, like every other three-brained being of the whole of our great universe, have three separate independent spiritualized parts, each of which has as a central place for the concentration of all its functioning a localization of its own, which they themselves call a brain. All the impressions in their common presences, whether coming from without or arising from within, are also perceived independently by each of these brains of theirs in accordance with the nature of these impressions. And afterwards, as it is also proper to proceed in the presences of every kind of being without distinction of brain system, these impressions, together with previous impressions, compose the total, and thanks to occasional shocks, evoke in each of these separate brains an independent association. So, my boy, from the time when these favorites of yours completely ceased consciously to actualize in their common presences the being part dog duty, thanks only to the results of which, what is called sane comparative mentation, as well as the possibility of conscious active manifestation, can arise in beings from various associations, and from the time when their separate brains, associating now quite independently, begin engendering in one and the same common presence three differently sourced being impulses, they then, thanks to this, gradually as it were, acquire in themselves three personalities having nothing in common with each other in respect of needs and interests. Rather more than half of all the anomalies arising in the general psyche of your favorites, particularly those of recent times, are due in the first place to their having in their entire presence a process of three different kinds of independent associations, evoking in them the being impulses of three localizations of different kinds and of different properties. And secondly, because there is a connection between these three separate localizations in them, as there is also in general in the presences of every kind of three-brained being, predetermined by great nature for other what are called common presence functionings. And thirdly, because from everything perceived and sensed, that is, from every kind of shock, associations of three different kinds of impressions proceed in the three said localizations, in consequence of which three totally different kinds of being impulses are evoked in one and the same whole presence. Then, on account of all this, a number of experiencings are nearly always proceeding in them at one and the same time, and each of these experiencings by itself evokes in the whole of their being an inclination for a corresponding manifestation, and in accordance with the definite parts of their total presence, a corresponding movement is thus actualized. Just these said differently sourced associative experiencings proceed in their common presences and ensue one from the other, also in accordance with the same law of sevenfoldness. The learned members of the club of the adherents of legal monism, belonging to this group then in Babylon, indicated what they wished in the movements and in the actions of the participants in the mysteries in the following way. For instance, suppose that in order to fulfill his role in the given mystery, according to lawful associations, a participant evoked in one or another of his brains some new impression or other. He was bound to react by some or other definite manifestation or movement. But he would intentionally produce this manifestation or movement not as he ought to have produced it, according to the law of sevenfoldness, but otherwise, and in these otherwises they inserted in a certain way whatever they considered necessary for transmission to distant generations. In order, my boy, that you should have a concrete representation of these Saturday demonstrations at which I was always glad to be present in order to rest from my intense activities at that time, I will give you an illustrative example of how these learned mystics demonstrated before the other learned members of the Club of the Adherents of Legal Monism various being experiencings and manifestations according to the flow of associations from among the number of which fragments for future mysteries were selected. For these demonstrations, they constructed in one of the large halls of the club a specially raised place which they then called the reflector of reality. But beings of subsequent epochs to whom the information concerning these Babylonian learned mysteries chanced to be transmitted, and who began imitating them and doing, as it were, the same, called and still call their constructions of a similar kind stages. Well then, two of the participants would always come upon these reflectors of reality, or stages, first, and then usually one of them stood for a while and, as it were, listened to his own what is called Darthelhoustian state, or as it is sometimes otherwise said, to the state of his own inner, associative general psychic experiencings. Listening in this way, he would make it clear to his reason, for instance, that the sum total of his associating experiencings emerged in the form of an urgent inclination to hit another being in the face, the sight of whom had always served as the cause for the beginning of the association of those series of impressions present in him, which had always evoked in his general psyche disagreeable experiencings, offensive to his own self-consciousness. Let us suppose that these disagreeable experiencings always proceeded in him when he saw someone who was then called Irodahuhun, which professional, their contemporary beings now call a policeman. Having then made this Darthelhoustian psychic state an inclination of his clear to his reason, but at the same time being on the one hand well aware that in the existing conditions of external social existence it was impossible for him to gratify his inclination to the full, and on the other hand, being already perfected by reason, and being well aware of his dependence on the automatic functioning of the other parts of his common presence, he clearly understands that on the gratification of this inclination of his depends the fulfillment of some imminent and important being duty of his, of great importance to those around him. And having thought over everything in this way, he decides to gratify this urgent inclination of his as best he can by at least doing a moral injury to that Irodahuhun, by evoking in him associations that would lead to unpleasant experiencings. With this object in view, he turns to the other learned being who has come onto the stage with him, and treating him now as an Irodahuhun, or policeman, he would say, "Hi, you! Don't you know your duty? Don't you see that there?" pointing with his hand at that moment in the direction of another small room of the club, where were the other participants of the demonstrations of that day. Two citizens, a soldier and a cobbler, are fighting in the street and disturbing the public peace, and here you are leisurely strolling about, imagining yourself God knows who, and leering at the passing wives of honest and respectable citizens. Just you wait, you scamp. Through my chief, the city's chief physician, I shall report to your chief your negligence and breach of duty. From that moment, the learned being who had spoken would become a physician, because he had chanced to call his chief the head physician of the city, while the second learned being, whom the former had called a policeman, would assume the role of a policeman. Two other participating learned beings were then immediately called from the other room by the one who assumed the role of policeman, and they assumed the roles of cobbler and soldier, respectively. And these two latter learned beings assumed and had to manifest themselves in just those roles, namely, one in the role of a soldier and the other in the role of a cobbler, only because the first learned being, who, having himself in accordance with his Darthelhoustian state, assumed the role of a physician, had called them soldier and cobbler, respectively. Well then, these three learned beings who were thus cast impromptu by the fourth learned being for fulfilling every kind of perception and manifestation which had to flow by law, of types foreign to them, or as your favorites say, of strange roles, namely of the roles of cobbler, soldier, and policeman, further produced their experiencings, and from them their reflex manifestations, thanks to the being property in them called Ikril Tazkakra, a property also well known to the learned beings of the planet Earth of that period, who were already able to perfect their presences up to the ableness of actualizing this property. Three-centered beings can acquire this said being property called Ikril Tazkakra only if there is already personally acquired in their presences what is called Esoer Itu Rasnian will, which in its turn can be obtained thanks to always the same being part dog duty, that is, to conscious labors and intentional sufferings. So it was in this way that the learned members of the group of the Mysterists, then in Babylon, became players of strange roles and demonstrated before the other learned members of the club the experiencings and the actions ensuing from them, which were produced in accordance with the directing of their well-informed reason. And thereafter, as I have already said, they, together with the other learned members of the club of the adherents of legal monism, who were present, selected the corresponding for their aim from among the being impulses demonstrated in such a way, which, according to the law of the flowing of different sourced associations, had to be experienced and manifested in the definite actions of the beings, and only then did they include those selected in the details of some mystery or other. Here it is very important to emphasize that then in Babylon, the three-brained learned beings who belonged to the group of the Mysterists did indeed reproduce in action amazingly well and accurately the subjective particularities of the perceptions and manifestations of various types foreign to them. They reproduced them well and accurately, not only because, as I have already explained, they possessed the being property, Ikrilit Kakra, but also because the learned beings of the planet Earth of that time were very well aware of what is called the law of typicality, and that the three-brained beings of their planet are ultimately formed into 27 different definite types, and also in which cases what had to be perceived and how it had to be perceived, and how they had to manifest themselves. Concerning the said being property I have just called Ikril Tazkakra, I must add further that just this property alone gives beings the possibility of restraining themselves within the limits of all these impulses and promptings which are evoked at any given moment in their common presences, by the associations flowing in that brain in which they themselves have consciously given the start for the associations of one or another series of impressions already present in them. And it is only thanks to this property that beings have the possibility of perceiving every kind of detail of the psyche of the type they have already previously well studied, and of manifesting themselves similarly to it, and fully impersonating it. In my opinion, it is on account of the absence of just that property that the majority of all these anomalies have arisen, which have resulted in the three-brained beings of the planet Earth, who have taken your fancy, becoming possessed of such a strange psyche. You must know that in the presences of the three-brained beings of the present time, as well as in the presences of every kind of three-brained being in general, every new impression is accumulated in all their three separate brains, in the order of what is called kindredness, and afterwards they take part with the impressions already previously registered in the associations evoked in all these three separate brains by every new perception in accordance with and in dependence upon what are called the gravity center impulses present at the given moment in their whole presence. So, my boy, in view of the fact that there continue to flow in the presences also of your contemporary favorites three kinds of independent associations which also continue to evoke different kinds of being impulses, and at the same time that they have already entirely seized the conscious actualization in their presences of all those cosmic results by means of which alone the mentioned being property can be acquired in three-brained beings, then, in consequence, the common presence of each of your contemporary favorites during the process of his existence consists, as I have already told you, as it were, of three quite separate personalities, three personalities which have and can have nothing in common with each other, either in respect of the nature of their arising or in respect of their manifestations. Hence it is that there just proceeds in them that particularity of their common presence, which is that with one part of their essence they always intend to wish one thing. At the same time, with another part, they definitely wish something else. And thanks to the third part, they already do something quite the contrary. In short, what happens in their psyche is just what our dear teacher, Mullah Nasser ad-Din, defines by the word, a mix-up. Concerning the demonstration of the Babylonian learned beings of that time belonging to the group of the Mysterists, I must add that in the course of the action, the number of the participants gradually increased by their other colleagues, also dependently on various voluntary associative happenings. And besides all this, every participant thus engaged in the fulfillment of the perceptions and accurate automatic manifestations that happened to be connected with him and were proper to a personality of a type quite foreign to him, had, at the same time that he was fulfilling that role, to give himself time, under some plausible pretext, to change into a corresponding costume. And they changed their costume in order to manifest themselves more clearly and more strikingly in the fulfillment of the roles they assumed, so that the other learned members present of the club of the adherents of Legomonism, who checked and selected the fragments of the future mysteries, could more easily and better follow them and make the best selection of everything they saw. On Sundays, namely on the days consecrated to music and singing, the learned beings belonging to this group first produced on various sound-producing instruments, and also with their voices, every kind of what is called melody, and then explained to all the other learned beings how they indicated in these works of theirs whatever they wished. They also had it in view to implant these works of theirs in the customs of various peoples, calculating that these melodies they created, passing from generation to generation, would reach men of remote generations who, having deciphered them, would discover the knowledge put into them, and that had already been attained on the earth, and would also use it for the benefit of their ordinary existence. For your understanding of how the learned beings there of that group made their indications in the musical and vocal productions of theirs, I must first explain to you about certain special particularities of the perceptive organ of hearing in the common presences of every kind of being. Among the number of these special particularities is the property called vibro-econitanco. You must know that those parts of the brains of beings which objective science calls lodistomaticules, and certain of which on your planet the terrestrial learned physicians call nerve-brain ganglia, are formed of what are called neurionosian crystallized vibrations, which in general arise in the completed formation of every being as a result of the process of all kinds of perceptions of their organ of hearing. And later on, these lodistomaticules, functioning from the reaction upon them of similar but not yet crystallized vibrations, evoke in the corresponding region, which is subject to the given brain, the said vibro-econitanco, or as it is sometimes called, remorse. In accordance with the foresight of great nature, these said lodistomaticules serve in the presences of beings as real factors for assisting the arising of the processes of association at those moments when either the promptings arisen within are absent, or the shocks coming from without do not reach their brains. and the as yet non-crystallized Nirionosian vibrations in general arise and later enter into the common presence of the beings, either by means of what are called the vocal cords of every kind of being, or by means of certain artificial sound-producing instruments, which the beings have invented. When these vibrations, arisen from the said sources, enter the presences of the beings, they touch the hilodistomaticules of one or another brain. Then, according to the general functioning of the whole being, they produce the said process of vibroecho-nitanko. The second particularity of the functioning of the perceptive organ of hearing is that in general, by the action of vibrations obtained from the sequence of sounds of every kind of melody, the association is usually evoked in the presences of the beings in one or another of the three brains, just in that brain in which, at the given moment, what is called the momentum of what was experienced is increasing more intensively, and the sequence of the impulses evoked for experiencing usually proceeds in an automatic order. The learned musicians and singers, then in the city of Babylon, combined their melodies in such ways that the sequence of the vibrations of the sounds should evoke in the beings a sequence of associations, and therefore also impulses for experiencings, not in the usual automatic order. That is to say, so that the sequence of vibrations on entering into the common presence of the beings should evoke the vibroecho-nitanko in the hilodistomaticules, not of just one brain, as it usually proceeds, according to which brain at the given moment the associations predominate, but should evoke it now in one brain, now in another, and now in the third. Thus they also provided for the quality, or as they themselves would say, the numbers of the vibrations of the sounds which would affect one or another brain. This latter, namely, from which vibrations, in which brain of the beings, which data are formed, and for which new perceptions these data might be what are called determinants of new resultants, they were also already quite familiar with. Owing to these sequences of sounds, which they combined simultaneously in the presences of beings, different kinds of impulses arose, which evoked various quite opposite sensations, and these sensations in their turn produced unusual experiencings in them, and reflex movements not proper to them. And truly, my boy, the sequence of sounds they combined did indeed affect all the beings into whose presence they entered, exceedingly strangely. Even in me, a being cast, as they would say, in another mold, various being impulses were engendered and were alternated with an unusual sequence. It happened in this way because, as the sounds of their melodies, which they had combined in a definite sequence, entered into my common presence, Jacques Clomb proceeded in them, or as it is otherwise said, the sounds were sorted out and acted equally upon all the three variously caused lodistomaticules, with the consequence that the associations proceeding in me in the three independent brains, though simultaneously and with an equal intensity of similar associations but differently natured series of impressions, engendered in my presence three quite different promptings. For instance, the localization of my consciousness, or as your favorites would say, my thinking center, engendered in my common presence, let us suppose, the impulse of joy. The second localization in me, or my feeling center, engendered the impulse called sorrow. And the localization of the body itself, or as once again your favorites would call it, my moving center, engendered the impulse of religiousness. And it was just in these unusual impulses engendered in the beings by their musical and vocal melodies that they indicated what they wished. And so, my boy, after all I have already related about this terrestrial, contemporary, famous art, I imagine you have enough to understand why and how, during the period of my 5th stay in person on your planet, I happened to be a witness of the events of the causes of its arising, and in what connection and with what meaning it was pronounced for the first time, just then at that period which your contemporary favorites call the Babylonian civilization. So I will now already speak about those facts there, after learning which you will be able clearly to represent to yourself, and approximately to understand how greatly the logical mentation in all these 3-brained beings who have taken your fancy must have deteriorated in so short a time that without any what is called constancy of self-individuality, they have submitted to be made slaves of those few from among their midst who are called wastrels, and who, in consequence of the total loss of the divine impulse conscience, could for their egoistic aims create from this empty word, art, which chanced to reach them, also such a surefire factor in all of them for the final atrophy of all the data that still survived in them for conscious being. When during the period of my 6th and last stay there in person, I heard everywhere about this contemporary art of theirs and came in contact with its results, and when I made clear to myself just what it was all about, then having recalled my Babylonian friends of that time and about their good intentions toward their remote descendants, I made clear to myself more in detail, as opportunities occurred, just which results were obtained from all that of which I had happened then to be a witness, and about which I have just been telling you, initiating you now into the impressions hidden from strangers and which became fixed in my common presence, and which were the result of my conscious perceptions during my last stay there in person on the surface of your planet concerning this contemporary art of theirs. My eye, with an arisen and profound being impulse of regret, must now emphatically state that of all the fragments of knowledge already attained by the beings of the Babylonian civilization, which fragments, it must be allowed, also contained a great deal, absolutely nothing has reached the beings of contemporary civilization for the benefit of their ordinary being existence, apart from a few empty words without any inner content. Not only absolutely nothing whatever reached them of all the various fragments of general knowledge already then known on the earth, which the learned beings, the adherents of legal monism, indicated in lawful divergencies from the sacred law of heptaparaparshinok, or as they called it, the law of sevenfoldness. But in the interval of time between these two civilizations of theirs, their being, rumination, has so deteriorated that they now already do not know nor even suspect the existence of such an all-universal law on their planet.